Guys, can you believe it? 2 weeks from now, we will finally be stepping into the final shape. Now, we're getting a host of sandbox changes. There's going to be meta shifts, but one of the things that Bungie has revealed to us is their change to pulse rifles. Now, I know some of you are probably like, Cross, you'll never catch me using a dad rifle. Fellas, there are 2 separate buffs that are hitting all of these pulse rifles. Today's video, we're going to be going over them though. We're going to give you the current and future DPS values, and then of course going over my personal recommendations of which pulse rifles are going to be popping off in the final shape. Now, first things first, how exactly is Bungie changing pulse rifles? Well, they're increasing the base PV damage versus all combatants. This is a 20% buff. Now, they did give some exceptions here. One being Graviton Lance, the other being Revision Zero's heavy burst mode, that being its 2-round burst mode. Now, I think some people read that and like, oh, okay, 20%, that's nice. Dude, 20%, that's massive. And it's not like it's just hitting 20% against minor combatants. It's against every single enemy type. All pulse rifles outside of Graviton Lance and Revision Zero's heavy burst mode will be hitting 20% hard. Now, the buffs don't end there. They're also increasing damage versus minors, this being red bar enemies, by 15%. This will stack with the base PV damage increase. So the 20% on top of the 15% is what's being applied here to pulse rifles. 2 substantial buffs. Now, in this one, Graviton Lance and Revision Zero's heavy burst mode will be included. Now, what does this mean mathematically? Well, pulse rifles at 1.2 times 1.15 gives us a 38% increase in damage, specifically against red bar enemies. Again, against orange bars, against bosses, it's still just going to be that 20%, which is still nice, but the 38% will be applicable to all red bar enemies. This is the equivalent of making our current legendary pulse rifles hit like our current exotic pulse rifles. I know Bungie's pulling that back a bit, but overall it is a net positive for pulse rifles. Now, so no surprise, people have been disappointed with how pulse rifles have felt in PvE for a very long time. I mainly only use it if I'm dealing with champions that require a pulse rifle to counter. Outside, of course, some of the top ones. Outbreak Perfected, I still use. Graviton Lance is another one I still use. Collective Obligation. But for the most part, especially after our subclasses have been changed to where they can counter champions within Destiny, guys, I just kind of opt out of using pulse rifles completely. Everything from SMGs to auto rifles to sidearms, they all outperformed in close range combat. And at mid range, I just preferred a hand cannon. And then when we got to long range, pulse rifles really dropped off as I just found myself relying on bows and scout rifles. As much as we talk about no one using scout rifles, I would argue and say less people are using pulse rifles in PvE. But with these 2 buffs, both our legendary and exotic pulse rifles will immediately rise to the top of the charts. However, in that same vein, we do need to mention that other primary weapons are also getting buffed. Now, this is because of the upcoming removal of spec mods. Sidearms, scout rifles, bows are all having their damage upped by 20%. Auto rifles are also getting that 15% buff that pulse rifles got, and SMGs are getting a 10% bump, and hand cannons are getting a slight bump and a 5% damage buff. Now, even with all of these increases, pulse rifles, we believe, are still going to be claiming those top spots when dealing with minors. Like, literally nothing will be able to take minors down better than pulse rifles. And that's typically what we use our primary weapons for anyways. That's just how impactful a 38% buff is. Now, there is another change we need to talk about before we start breaking down DPS values, and that is the nerf to our exotic pulse rifles. Like we mentioned above, Bungie is dialing things back for our exotic primaries. Quote, we're reducing damage bonus versus minors from 40% to 30%, except fighting lion. Now, that means that every exotic primary will be doing 10% less damage at base. Now, of course, a lot of this has been offset by many of the buffs we mentioned just above, but this nerf does need to be kept in mind since we can't just add 38% to every pulse rifle's current DPS and just call it a day. So with all the changes out of the way, let's look at our current pulse rifle DPS, how they compare, and then how things will be changing in our new sandbox. Now, I'm going to start with our legendary pulse rifles. In terms of 1 mag DPS, aggressive pulse rifles like Blast Furnace have a DPS value of 26,400. Then you have high impacts like Messenger and Cold Denial with a DPS value of 26,975. Lightweights like Chattering Bone, BXR, they have a DPS value of 27,132. And adapters like Smiter Moraine clock in at 27,293. And finally, we have rapid fires with weapons like Autumn Wind or Peace of Mind. Their 1 mag DPS is 28,582. But understand, when it comes to DPS, guys, context is extremely important. That being, what is the DPS values of some of our other primary families? For 140 round per minute hand cannons, think things like Midnight Coup. They have a 1 mag DPS of 35,270. 600 round per minute auto rifles have their DPS values at 26,705. 900 round per minute SMGs deal 35,316 DPS, and then 360 round per minute sidearms gives us a DPS value of 37,124. 4. Now keep in mind, this is not including perks, and this is under perfect conditions. With that being said though, it's clear to see that pulse rifles are cemented at the bottom. Hand cannons, sidearms, and SMGs all deal about 10,000 more DPS than even the best pulse rifles, which is why you don't see anyone using legendary pulse rifles. Sure, I love things like Graviton Lance. I used it for a number of different builds, especially our build battles. I'm a big fan of Outbreak Perfected and Collective Obligation, but unfortunately they are the outliers when compared to other pulse rifles. Now before talking about pulse rifles and how they're going to be rising to the top in the final shape, I do want us to take a quick look at our current exotic pulse rifles and their performance. If we were to look at the DPS against red bar enemies for Graviton's Lance, this is a unique case with its 2-round burst mode. It clocks in at 50,518 DPS. Now for another unique pulse rifle, we have Revision 0 with its 2-round burst mode sitting above at 57,966 DPS. Now in its 4 burst mode, Revision 0 has a DPS value of 35,476. And I know you're probably like, wow, that is such a tremendous drop off. And it is. Again, Bungie has buffed that 2-round burst mode multiple times. The thing that the 4-round burst mode has is the ability to get to that sniper rifle shot faster. So that's kind of its pro and con. Now, Outbreak Perfected has a DPS value of 37,963, but keep in mind, more people are using Outbreak, the stronger it is, hence why it's so good in damage phases when you run out of ammo elsewhere. No Time to Explain sits at 38,018 DPS. Vigilant Swing actually has a hefty DPS of 46,618. I know, surprising. Bad Juju sits at 38,501 DPS. And then Collective Obligation, not dipping into its perk, just its sheer damage by itself, no weakening, no nothing, 34,200 DPS. Now, it's obvious right here that these pulse rifles are coming in pretty much at 40% better than their legendary counterparts. But the two I want to bring attention to are, of course, Graviton Lance and Revision 0, that being Revision in its 2 burst mode. These two are way ahead of every other exotic, which makes sense why Bungie didn't buff those alongside everything else. Granted, it is still getting a buff with that 15% buff, it's just not getting the 20% flat buff. And at the end of the day, it's still a net positive from that 40% to 30% drawback. Now let's talk again our legendary pulse rifles. With this 38% damage buff against minors, our new 1 mag DPS for aggressives will be sitting at 36,432. High impacts will be at 37,226. Lightweights will be at 37,442. Adaptives at 37,664. And rapid fires at 39,443. Now I know rapids look to be the clear winner, but I do want to mention, guys, this is all base. There are multiple roles amongst these other archetypes that allows these weapons to pull ahead or even match. Aggressives, for instance, like Blast Furnace, where you can get things like kinetic tremors and another damage perk, that really allows that weapon to shine, making it a top contender despite its base 1 mag DPS being slightly lower than its competitors. Now, if we were to add in hand cannons and the buff they're getting, this will crank up 140s to 37,034 DPS. Auto rifles will jump up to 30,710 DPS. SMGs will jump up to 38,847 DPS. And sidearms will still remain in the lead at 44,548 DPS. Better lock down those heliocentrics, fellas. With that being said though, despite sidearms holding that very top spot, second place is now held by rapid fire pulse rifles. But keep in mind, sidearms require you to be up close. Pulse rifles don't, which is why we're thinking pulse rifles are going to be the best option next season. Excuse me, next episode. And this is true for both legendaries and exotics. But on the topic of exotic pulse rifles, let's look at where these will compare to each other after they receive both the slight exotic nerf, but also the big pulse rifle buff to determine which exotic pulse rifle is going to be the true king. Starting out with our unique cases, Graviton Lance will sit at 52,286 DPS. This is after a 10% nerf, but a 15% buff. So again, overall, a net positive. Revision 0 in its 2 burst mode will be coming out at 59,994 DPS, as it will be affected the same way. And yes, we are going to be testing the sniper rifle just to see how this applies. Normally, Bungie will specify, but every now and then things do overlap. And if that sniper rifle shot gets a bump, that's going to be very nice. Then on to our other exotic primaries that got that 10% nerf, but a 38% buff. Revision 0 in its 4 bursts will be dealing 44,061 DPS. Outbreak Perfected is going to jump up to 47,150 DPS. No Time to Explain will also be jumping up to 47,218. Bad Juju will be at 47,818. And Collective Obligation will be at 42,476. And get this, Vigilant Swing will be clocking in at a surprising 57,894 DPS. The problem with Vigilant Swing is there's literally nothing in its perk kit that's meant for PvE, but impressive nonetheless. No lie for me, guys, it's Outbreak Perfected that looks to be the clear winner. I know it may not have the best DPS value here, but we're really banking on reround rounds to be the perk that full sends this exotic to that next level. That's what I'm really hoping for. And for my PvP PvP players. We literally brought Outbreak perfected inside of trials, and it's very good in PvP, especially considering Bungie just recently buffed lightweight pulse rifles in PvP. Now keep in mind, Revision 0 in its 2-burst mode does remain at the top, but a lot of people don't really like the way it feels. I'm one of those. I don't really like the way it shoots and feels inside of PvE. The ammo economy is not my favorite. Vigilance Wing holds the second spot, but again, not really something I'm too crazy about, considering there's nothing in its perk kit that's really helping me here. Graviton Lance, though, I think is still going to be a top option, despite it missing out on some of the big buffs here. Now remember, this list is against red bar enemies. The moment we talk about any other enemy type, Outbreak comes out on top. But overall, I think the main thing to take away from all of this is that pulse rifles are going to be performing a lot better, which brings us to my list of pulse rifles that I recommend to you. I want to start with our exotics first. My first recommendation, to no one's surprise, Graviton Lance. Yes, it is getting a 10% nerf to its splash damage, but that 15% buff is going to totally offset that. And the fact is that in all of our build battles, when utilizing Graviton Lance, those Seekers are just simply too good. Its ability to add clearing game modes like Onslaught is too dominant not to put up here at the top of the list. And in terms of like feeding that Transcendence bar with Prismatic, at least on the light side, Graviton is going to do that very easily. And let me just say, I love combining it with things like Unraveling Rounds. You can apply it with your melee there on Warlock, follow up with the Graviton Lance, and really start spamming the Unraveling Rounds with the splash damage of Graviton Lance. It's quite nasty. After that though, I am going to be giving Revision 0 another try. Now I wanted to put Vigilance Wing up here, but I'm just still torn on this weapon. Like there's just no way Vigilance Wing, despite it clocking in at amazing damage values, there's just no way that I'm going to be like, yo, we're going into the day one raid. Everybody break out that Vigilance Wing. It's just not going to happen, right? Like surely not. Yes, we will be clocking in. We'll be seeing how it fits into the next environments. But Revision 0 is one of those that Bungie has buffed over and over. They're literally begging us to use it. Personally, I find that it's an awkward pulse rifle considering it runs into situations of being but the good damage dealer weapon to high health targets, but also kind of crappy when it comes to clearing ads. I'm just saying. Now, another exotic that I highly recommend, and this is one that's going to be readily available for my folks that are running Pantheon right now, and that is Collective Obligation. It has the best void synergy in the game. Where it lacks in damage in comparison to Graviton Lance, it makes up for in complete utility. I'm also really curious just to see how this is going to play in a prismatic environment, but I will say for my folks that like to dip into that weaken, that suppression, that volatile, there's never been a better time to get this exotic than through the Pantheon quest, allowing you to bypass your RNG. Yes, you will have to do Pantheon, but the reward at the end is very much worth it, as you can immediately pull that exotic. Now, the last recommendation for my exotics is, of course, Outbreak. Simply by completing 0 hour right now, you can get the craftable roll of this pulse. And yes, we have a guide on this. Let me just say already, just out the gate with Rapid Hits and Outlaw, Outbreak is already performing fantastically. And you never know if you're going to be in a situation like Caretaker Day 1, where you are completely out of ammo and your entire team needs to swap to a primary weapon to finish off the boss. That is when Outbreak truly shines. We actually had this in our top 16 exotic videos for this reason alone. Personally, I just love the way Siva Nanite spawn. I love how it could spawn on kill or it could spawn when just laying into a target. But that exotic pulse rifle is a must-have. On top of that, the 0 hour mission is also one you should experience, guys. It's a fantastic mission. Now, moving on to our legendaries. The first I'm going to recommend is one of my personal favorites, and that is the BXR Battler. It is a craftable, lightweight pulse rifle. Now, strangely enough, why I'm recommending BXR is that it actually has good hip-fire performance. Not that you should be hip-firing with a pulse rifle, but if you do have enemies pushing you constantly, but also enemies that spawn from afar, BXR has the ability to go from both ranges very easily. Now, the real lightweight pulse rifle that's probably going to be performing the best is going to be Chattering Bone. Chattering Bone is the last wish pulse rifle. It's also craftable. Yes, you can get it from Riven's Wishes. You can also get it from just doing the last wish raid. But the beautiful thing about this pulse rifle is that it can roll double damage perks. You can get things like Kill Clip in that third column, and then simultaneously stack it with Kinetic Tremors or even Rampage. When talking about this 38% increase in damage on top of double damage perks, Chattering Bone is going to be an absolute monster. Now, in terms of rapid fire pulse rifles, one I'm going to recommend here is Darkest Before. First up, we're going to be able to enhance the perks of Darkest Before in the final shape. This is a prophecy weapon dungeon drop. It will have the highest pulse rifle DPS in the game, and it has a fantastic solar perk combination, that being Heal Clip and Incandescence. Many have not been interested in Darkest Before, even with its re-release. But personally, guys, I feel like that Heal Clip Incandescent roll, which we love so much at Heliocentric, is also going to be pretty good on Darkest Before. Now, my last legendary pulse rifle that I want to recommend is, of course, Blast Furnace. Another weapon that you're going to be able to enhance in the final shape, giving it enhanced perks. Even its shiny roll variants will have enhanced perks for everything in that third and fourth column. It's got crazy combinations though, including Kinetic Tremors, Furnace, Desperate Measures, Firefly, One for All. We did an entire review on Blast Furnace if you want to check that one out, but that is a very good pulse rifle. And again, many are writing all of these pulse rifles off. But the buff that's coming for it, guys, is going to be substantial. Something you're going to notice day one. And what I love is that this isn't just going to be something specific to exotic pulse rifles. No, this is going to spread to our legendaries, and I'm excited to see how this shakes up our future sandbox. Well, fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
Slap that like button like your mama told you right.